Thank you very, very much. It's good to be back here in Texas. I've actually been here, I think, 4 times in the last year. And let's see, the first trip I came down to Fort Worth to visit with Katie Farmer at BNSF and to see the amazing Alliance rail yard. Then I went down with Marty Oberman, my chair, to go to a NEPA hearing in Beaumont, which was very interesting, and we left at like 6 in the morning, so we got to see all the lights as the plane was taking off. It was quite incredible. Then a couple of weeks later, I came back to Texas and took another trip down, went to Houston, and then to the border crossing at Laredo, and I will talk about that later. So, some of you may not be very familiar with the Surface Transportation Board, so let me briefly explain what its responsibilities are and what they are not. By the way, do you have my slides? Ah, good. You can take the next slide. By the way, I need to say this. This is from our sponsor. The statements that I make today don't represent the opinions of the board or any other members. I also will welcome questions when I finish, but I can't talk about any pending matters in answer to questions. I am going to talk about one very important pending matter, but just so to explain to you what it is and why we did it. But I'm going to, unfortunately, because it hasn't been finalized yet, I'm not going to be able to take any questions. Next slide. So, little history. The Surface Transportation Board is the successor to the famed Interstate Commerce Commission, itself established in 1867 during the administration of Grover Cleveland for the express purpose of doing something about the railroad monopolies. The STB's current scope of responsibilities, we were established in 1996, really go back to the Staggers Act in 1980, before that, when Congress worked to rescue what were then our pretty ailing railroads through a combination of rate deregulation and then offloading from the railroads the obligation to carry passenger service. And over the next 20 years, the ICC and then the STB, its successor, played a very active role in permitting unhealthy railroads to consolidate and unload underutilized assets. Next slide. This is not my NCAA March Madness bracket. This, in fact, and I'm sorry, I mean, it's a little hard to read, but I think you get the gist of it. This is what happened between 1960 and 2000, the railroads in this country, and it shows, the 40 railroads that finally became Norfolk Southern, CSX, Union Pacific, and BNSF. And then we have, of course, the Canadian Pacific acquired the Soo Line, and Canadian National acquired the Gulf and Illinois Central. And then we have the Kansas City Southern down in this part of the country that acquired a railroad in Mexico, excuse me. So today, the Surface Transportation Board has jurisdiction over rail mergers, service, rate disputes. We no longer set rates like the old ICC did. We approve construction of new rail lines, and we have a lot of cases dealing with abandonments. There's a lot of old railroad trackage around the country, and believe me, half of the 600 cases that we get every year, I think, have to do with abandonments and real estate. And we have a couple of other dogs and cats, like we deal with interstate buses. Again, not rates, but mostly acquisitions of interstate bus systems. So, next slide. Let me tell you what we are not. We are not the National Safety Transportation Board. And as you can imagine, over the last couple of weeks, people have been asking me, what are you doing about East Palestine? And I have to say, I don't have anything to do with East Palestine. That's Jennifer Homendy. She's the chair of the NTSB. She's an absolutely remarkable woman. I was privileged to sit next to her during our confirmation hearing, and the great thing about sitting next to Jennifer is she got all the questions. And people kind of forgot about me. Now, safety is not our middle name, but we do review safety and indeed hazardous waste transportation as part of our environmental review processes for matters that require it. And for example, the environmental impact statement for the CP-KCS merger actually covered this issue in depth, and I'll talk about that merger at the end. Now, until recently, we have been described as a sleepy backwater agency. The ST what? But not anymore. Excellent. Last year, just after I started with the board, we had a record number of proceedings. We had a hearing on reciprocal switching in March, went on for 2 days. We had the Amtrak Gulf Coast proceeding that went on for 11 days until they came to their senses and decided to resolve their differences outside of our court. We had a 2-day hearing on urgent issues in freight rail in April. We had, I think, 5 days of hearings on the merger, and then we had a couple of days of hearings on the UP embargoes in December. Now, while Amtrak and its 11 days and the merger took a whole lot of our time, really our focus this year has been, and this has been directed by our chairman, but with the full support of all the members of the board, our primary focus has been on rail service, really the historic meltdown of service that we had seen over the last couple of years that had actually implicated America's ability to feed the world. This is all happening when Ukraine is blowing up, and it's needed to keep our water supplies safe. We got to deliver chlorine. And our utilities have to keep the lights on. We got to deliver coal and oil and all of that. And things weren't so good. Today we have 7 Class 1 railroads that are doing extremely well. From a financial perspective, they're very healthy. They're the darlings of Wall Street. And they've returned over $199 billion with a B to their shareholders over the last 10 years. Financially, they're doing a really good job. But in the view of some, they've achieved this with massive cost cutting through something called precision scheduled railroading, service reductions, and so forth, that have been frankly enabled by the fact that the railroads, they aren't like grocery stores. They don't quite compete the same way because they have these networks that have been quite consolidating. There has been a singular focus on something called the OR ratio, that's operating costs over revenue. And the compensation of their CEOs is actually based on whether they hit a certain OR, whether it's 62 or 60, or everybody's trying to get to 59. So by the time I joined the board over a year ago, they'd been hearing from a very broad range of stakeholders about inconsistent and unreliable rail service. We even heard from the Secretary of Agriculture about the impact of these trends, particularly with respect to shippers of agriculture and energy products, and of course both are very important in Texas. So as I mentioned, the board decided to do something about this and held a 2-day hearing in April. And then in response to that, we issued an order that required a number of the railroads to submit what we called service recovery plans, as well as providing additional data, regular progress reports on service operations, and importantly, on employment. Most of us believe that the shortage of labor may be at the core of the railroad service problems. Our chairman, Marty Oberman, has been very outspoken in his view of the cause. He looks at a 30% reduction in labor forces in connection with the implementation of PSR going back to like 2015, 2016. And then there were even further cuts, as much as 20% during COVID. And then you had, the great resignation, and the railroads went to hire up again, and people didn't come back. And they could barely keep up with attrition. So, now, another thing that we didn't have anything to do with was the labor crisis last fall and all the labor negotiations. People are always asking me, are you involved in, what's going on with labor and, getting the deal done in the Congress and all that? No, we really didn't have any role in that. We did have a role in telling the White House and the Congress what would happen if the railroad shut down. Tried to paint as grim a picture as we could. It would have been a real calamity. But since then, a number of the railroads have entered into new agreements going beyond what they agreed to under the congressional resolution. They are reaching agreements with their labor unions on paid sick leave, and that was really at the core of the labor dispute last fall. So when they did this, we actually put out a press release. When I first read it, I said, wait a minute, this isn't our bailiwick, and several of my board members said, yeah, but it's too important not to comment on. So what we said was, these types of collaborative efforts to tackle quality of life issues should result in a further strengthening of our national rail network by promoting both retention of existing workers and providing incentives for potential new hires. So we see the resolution of the major labor disputes as being very important in bringing the health of the railroads from a service perspective back. So, next slide. But then, later in the year, we noticed something very peculiar. We saw a startling number of increase in what are called embargoes put in place by Union Pacific Railroad. Embargoes are notices to their customers that they will not be served for some period of time or will only be served by specific agreement with the railroad. And by the end of the year, Union Pacific had over 1,000 embargoes. Now, historically, and under AAR rules, embargoes are only supposed to be used as a result of floods or derailments or bridges out or other sudden calamities where they physically cannot serve a customer. But it was apparent that UP was using them to manage their network on a day-to-day basis, allegedly to address congestion problems. They said their network had too many cars on it, and they had to get rid of some of the cars and make it flow better, and in the meantime, they were telling their customers they couldn't pick up on a regular basis. So we called them to the carpet and said, what are you going to do about it? And at this hearing, we had, their customers come and tell us what it was doing to them and the cost it was imposing on them. But we have seen improvement. Union Pacific has now managed to significantly reduce their embargoes due to congestion. The current performance of the railroads, in fact, is getting better. The eastern carriers, CSX and NS, have been able to dramatically increase their train and engine employees and now have more T&E employees than they did in 2022. This is very good. CSX has increased their employment by 7.4% among these critical T&E employees, and NS has had in the last year a 9.7% increase. And it's very hard just to stay ahead of attrition, but they're actually bringing more people on. The increase in T&E employments of the Western railroads, UP and BNSF, has not been as dramatic, and their counts are still below their March 2020 levels. They've had a lot of course, weather-related challenges this year as well. But BNSF and UP have seen improvements in their intermodal trip plan compliance. They set a schedule for when they're going to pick up and when they're going to deliver, and then they measure their own performance against that. And BNSF's trip plan compliance increased from 61% to 88%, and UP's went from 68% to 79%. Manifest trip plan compliance on the eastern railroads has also seen vast improvements, and so we're very pleased to see that. Grain is also moving better. Union Pacific's went from 64 to 68 in a year. BNSF's went from 63 to 70%. Next slide, please. So, where are we going from here? We have a number of pending rulemakings that should help to improve matters long-term, including those related to reciprocal switching, a proposed rule that has been around since King George, I think. We have a rule on first mile, last mile service, which is basically a reporting rule. And we have under consideration a new emergency service rule. And we have our rules on small case arbitration and what's called final offer rate review, which is applying baseball arbitration to railroad rate disputes. And those are now final. So, oh, yes, one other thing, the dead chickens. In the middle of this, I got a call from Congressman Costa from the Central Valley of California one day, and I'd gotten to know him earlier when I was working on high-speed rail in California. I also, by the way, between working for FRA and my current job, worked on Texas Central here in Texas. And he said, the Foster Farms hasn't had a delivery in several weeks, and if we don't get one within the next 4 or 5 days, 1 million chickens are going to die. So they had gone through some informal stuff with their Office of Government Affairs, but Marty called up the head of Union Pacific and said, it shouldn't take a call from the head of the STB to the CEO of Union Pacific to get chickens fed in California, but that's exactly where we are. And we got the chickens fed. So we were very pleased about that. I am not pleased to see that, in fact, the flooding in California now in the southern Central Valley, which is creating this new old Lake Tulare, may actually be also aggravating the chicken problem. But we love our chickens. Let's talk about the merger now. It's drawn a lot of questions about why the board would approve further consolidation in an already, as I showed you, very consolidated rail industry, particularly a board which has 5 members, 3 of which are tree-hugging Democrats. What is going on? I should say the board is not partisan at all. I mean, we work very closely together, and we agree on most things. But the important thing to know here is that CP and KCS are Class 1 railroads. They're 2 of 7, but individually they're far smaller than the other 5 with whom they compete for business. And even after they merge, the combined system, which will be known as CPKC, Canadian Pacific Kansas City, will continue to be the smallest Class 1 railroad. We ultimately determined that the transaction would not harm competition and would produce, in fact, measurable public benefits. Next slide. What this slide shows you is the service territories of Canadian Pacific, mostly the northern tier across Canada and then down to Kansas City, and then Kansas City Southern comes down to Texas and goes into Mexico. So the transaction is end-to-end, which means there's no track redundancies. You're not eliminating competition between KCS and CP with respect to customers because they don't have parallel routes. Instead, what's going to happen is that for customers of the joint system, it will reduce the travel time for traffic moving over a single line. It should increase incentives for investment, and it will eliminate the need for the two now separate CP and KCS systems to interchange traffic moving from one system to another. And they interchange not just in Kansas City, but in Chicago and various other places. So this should, in our view, enhance efficiency, which in turn will enable the new system to better compete for traffic with the other Class 1 carriers. Carriers, you know, they have these big systems, and really, in our view, the best thing to make them compete is to give them a better competitor. And so that was kind of the viewpoint that we brought to this decision. Now, the merger will create the first railroad providing single-line service spanning Canada, the United States, and Mexico. We have now a NAFTA railroad. And this new direct service is going to facilitate the flow of grain from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast, here in Texas and Mexico, the movement of intermodal goods between here in Dallas, Texas, and Chicago, Illinois, and the trade in automotive parts, which you people in Texas are familiar with, finished vehicles, and other containerized mixed goods between the United States and Mexico. And they're hoping to pull a lot of trucks off the roads in Mexico. Next slide. But we wanted to address any potential anti-competitive harms, and so we imposed numerous conditions designed to protect competition, not competitors. We protect competition. We wanted to make sure that the merger would not reduce any shipper's competitive options that exist today. We have established an unprecedented 7-year monitoring period during which CPKC will be required to furnish us detailed information on their operations. And we have put some teeth behind their voluntary agreement that they would keep their gateways, and gateways are connection points between their railroads and other railroads, keep them open on commercially reasonable terms, and preserve routing options to other railroads that were available to shippers before the merger. So, among other things, we will require CPKC to justify in writing, upon a customer's request, any rate increases over a certain level on interline movements that are subject to the gateway obligation. So they said, we're going to keep these gateways open on commercially reasonable terms. We're not sure exactly what that means, but at least we're going to make them justify it if they raise their rates. Now, one such very critical gateway is Laredo, Texas, which I got to visit a couple of months ago when I was down here and see the border crossing for myself. See where KCS, separate and apart from the merger, is building a second bridge with their own money. And this is a place where KCS Mexico, KCSM, their trains come in, and then that traffic either goes on KCS over towards Houston, or it can interchange with UP or BNSF a little bit down the road. So we're going to be looking at Laredo very, very carefully to ensure that CPKC does not engage in any kind of rate manipulation or other conduct that can fail to keep Laredo open on commercially reasonable terms. There's some other gateways in Texas, including Rosenberg and Dallas, and we'll be looking at what they're doing there as well. We are, as I mentioned, establishing very extensive data reporting requirements that will enable us to closely monitor whether they're, in fact, preserving these options. And we will be able to issue additional orders later, if necessary, to enforce required environmental mitigation measures and address capacity and maintain fluidity in Houston, which is very congested, Chicago, need not say anything more, and other congested areas. I mentioned that we did an extensive environmental impact study. We gave everyone an opportunity along these two lines to participate in the process. I think we had 5 or 6 local meetings. I attended one in Beaumont with my chairman, and the final EIS was 5,000 pages long, including all the appendices. And the findings of that EIS report are adopted along with the decision. And we approved important measures designed to mitigate potential environmental impacts. We also took a very hard look at the safety implications of the merger. As you can imagine, since the events in East Palestine, we've gotten a lot of incoming from people saying, oh, if we get another train through our town, it's going to fall over and blow us all up. But in fact, we did look at the potential for derailments and various other things in connection with the merger. And we think actually this will improve safety. First of all, it goes without saying that transportation over rail is much safer and better for the environment than putting stuff on trucks. The railroads predict that, in fact, this merger will take 64,000 truckloads off the road and put them on rail. We also noted that Canadian Pacific, over the last 15 years, has, by at least some measures, the best safety record of all the Class I railroads. So any rail traffic that is diverted onto CPKCS from another railroad may be going from a railroad that's less safe to a railroad that's more safe, at least one that has a better safety record. During the environmental process, we also heard from many communities up and down the right-of-way, from places in Iowa and Minnesota and Illinois about, and then down here, of course, about grade crossing safety and delays. And I know that my good friend Paul Worley, is he here tonight? Anyway, he's going to be talking about grade crossing issues tomorrow. After Marty and I were in Beaumont, and we'd heard some testimony on grade crossing issues in Houston while we were in Beaumont, my colleague Robert Primus and I took a special trip to Houston to look firsthand at several grade crossings where existing traffic is causing significant problems. Now, in the course of the environmental review, there were no grade crossings identified where the limited number of new trains would require specific mitigation, such as building a new grade crossing or a tunnel or whatever. But we have ordered CPKC to work with communities in support of securing funding in conjunction with appropriate state agencies for grade crossing mitigation projects. This is something KCS has done extensively in Laredo, and they've put in an application with the city of Laredo for a whole system of grade crossing improvements on their line through Laredo. We have also ordered the railroad to operate under what's called the General Code of Operating Rules, which provides that when practical, a standing train or switching movement must avoid blocking a public crossing longer than 10 minutes. You know what happens when the train is sitting there for 20 minutes or an hour and, emergency vehicles can't get through. Now, a number of states either have passed or are considering blocked crossing legislation, but whether such state-level actions are preempted by federal rail safety or by STB authorities is before the courts. But what we're doing, we're not going to wait for that issue to be resolved. We're ordering CPKC to notify emergency services dispatching centers of all crossings blocked by trains that are stopped or may be unable to move for a significant period of time. Union Pacific was doing that a while back in Houston, and then for whatever reason they stopped doing it. They've started doing it again, and CPKC is going to have to do that. The railroad must also conduct proactive and targeted outreach to minority and low-income communities that would experience adverse noise impacts as a result of the acquisition, how they can go about establishing quiet zones. So they'll be giving communities assistance in doing that. CPKC has committed to meet regularly with community representatives in the Houston area. And if those communities experience merger-related impacts, they're going to work with them on ways to address their concern. Finally, as I mentioned, in October, Board Member Primus and I met with elected officials, the mayor, Congresswoman Lee, various community groups, to gain a better understanding of their long-standing concerns about existing rail congestion and blocked crossings. And one of the things that I talked to them about at the time was the suggestion that they ought to consider working with the railroads to do what Chicago did 20 years ago through a program that the city and the railroads together cooperated called CREATE. It stands for something I can't remember, but it's the CREATE program in Chicago. And I know Mayor Turner has embraced this and has communicated with the administrator of FRA that he'd like a CREATE program in Houston. And I have offered to do whatever I can to facilitate it. Interestingly enough, the CREATE program in Chicago was in fact started by Linda Morgan, the then chairman of the STB. So the issue of block crossings is really something that I think needs to be addressed on a national basis and probably needs some new national legislation, and because it's a regulatory gap. If the states can't do it, okay, well, the feds can do it, but they're not doing it, so who's going to do it? Texas Representative Sylvia Garcia has introduced a bill to give the states and local governments some ability to address the issue. So when we issued this decision, because of the amount of time I had spent down in Houston and looking at this issue, I thought it was important enough to put in a short separate statement on this issue. It's like a concurring opinion. And what I wrote is that I fully expect that the board will concern itself with focusing the railroads and the affected communities on actively working together to develop solutions to the block crossing dilemma and address congestion-related issues more generally. Last slide. And this is what I said. And it will become apparent why I'm putting this picture up. I said, if such cooperation does not occur, or does occur, but does not result in positive outcomes, the board stands ready to draw and potentially let fly every arrow in its existing quiver to address these issues should such action become necessary. This is a famous old engraving of the Native Americans looking at the first transcontinental railroad passing through their lands. The Surface Transportation Board is going to likewise keep a very sharp eye on today's new transcontinental railroad passing through the country. One other thing that I have to mention, because it's here. We think that this merger of two freight railroads is actually going to enhance passenger rail service. CPKC is committed to support Amtrak's existing plans, and they have many, for expanded service on the new railroad's lines. In Texas, Canadian Pacific has agreed to participate in a joint study including Amtrak, Norfolk Southern, Union Pacific, relevant government agencies, with the goal of introducing Amtrak service between Meridian, Mississippi, and Dallas, Texas. And Knox Ross is going to talk about that tomorrow. So I hope you now understand a little bit better what the STB does and what it does not do. And we don't have a lot to do with East Palestine or labor disputes, but we're still making headlines. This was the Chicago Tribune from a day last week with our chairman, Marty Oberman, on the cover, and it goes on for 2 pages of his discussion of this merger. So, doesn't say Dewey wins, but it's got Marty on the cover, so I'm really pleased about that. So I'm happy to answer any questions, but I can't talk about the merger or anything that's specifically pending. Thank you.
All right, if you do have questions, you know the routine. Just wait for the microphone, please. Just raise your hand.
Oh, I am live. Okay. You were talking about your workforce issues in the beginning of the presentation, or closer
Right.
to the beginning, and I was just wondering if you had tried or had you had any success with apprenticeships or internships in terms of being able to recruit and grow new employees.
That is not something that we specifically facilitate. There may be some funding for from FRA to do it. It is certainly, you got to bring people in early. I mean, the railroads bring people who've never worked for a railroad into a 6-week or 8-week long training program. It's very intense. Only about half of them kind of stay or survived after it's over. But that's what they do. There are also programs in a number of community colleges around the country specifically focused on railroads. And I participated in a forum a couple of years ago at a community college on the south side of Chicago. Needless to say, there are a lot of railroads in Chicago, and they're always looking for people. And they actually have a railroad program at this community college.
The new bridge that is in Laredo, has that been finished, or is it?
No, it has. It's under construction.
Okay.
They started construction a couple of months ago. They had a big ceremony with people on both sides of the border, and they walked to the middle. And but it is under construction. It is not contingent on the merger. This was something they were going to do from the beginning.
Thank you.
KCS.
Do we have a bridge in Presidio yet?
I do not know the answer.
Railroad bridge?
I do not know. Do you have it? Okay.
You'll hear more from TxDOT on that tomorrow. The bridge has already been built. They're waiting on a CBP hut and an X-ray machine, as I understand.
Those X-ray machines are amazing. I got to see one when I was in Laredo. They had a train come through, and it's not X-rays, it's some other kind of technology, but you can see through like 6 inches of steel to see what is there, and they can tell if there is a human being inside the train or something that's an anomaly that might be drugs. So it's pretty cool technology.
Can you tell us a little bit about your experiences here in Texas? I believe it was with the Trans-Texas Corridor and also Texas Central.
Well, I worked for a law firm that worked around the country on public-private partnerships. And so one of the leading states exploring P3s was the state of Texas. State of Virginia was another one. And so Governor Perry hired my old law firm to help him develop the proposals for the Trans-Texas Corridor, which would have included, I mean, on paper it looked great, you know, these massive corridors connecting the various parts of the state that would have rail lines and utility lines and a highway. So you were actually minimizing the footprint of these transportation corridors. That is not how folks in the legislature viewed it. My partner came down and testified and barely got out with a hair on the top of his head. I also spent a lot of time down here working on I-35 and some public-private partnerships on the highway side, and that's how I wound up. My first year I spent in the Obama administration at the Department of Transportation was as Chief Counsel of the Federal Highway Administration. And because of my experience, I think the last time I was in this area, I did drive I-35, and I hope no one would, you know, blame me for it. I didn't design it. But they did some, you know, remarkable financial engineering on those roads. I mean, Texas was really kind of ahead of the game in figuring out how to finance highways essentially with private money. So that's my prior experience in Texas before I came down here. And then between the time I left FRA in 2015 and last year when I joined the Surface Transportation Board, I did serve as a financial advisor to Texas Central. We do not have any pending matters relating to Texas Central currently before the board, so I can say I think it's a terrific project. Conceptually, the Japanese that have invested most of the money in that project, they actually did a scan of corridors, connections between two cities all over the country, and they found the city pair between Dallas and Houston to be by far and away the most likely to produce the highest amount of rail passenger traffic. You have two growing cities. You've got a lot of congestion on the highways connecting them. There's no rail service between the two. You know, our passenger railroads go east and west. They don't go north and south. And so there is this gap. They may have underestimated initially the cost. That always happens with new projects. There's nothing new about that. But it certainly doesn't have the financial challenges that high-speed rail in California does, which has to, between San Francisco and Los Angeles, go through 3 mountain ranges. 20 miles of tunnels just to cross the Tehachapi's. You don't have to do that. The geology, the land, I understand from the engineers between Dallas and Houston's a little squishy, so they're going to have to elevate it. And that kind of may have driven the cost up. But for the amount of traffic, it should be a blow-away success if it gets moving again. It will require some amount of government capital funding. There's no question about that. But operationally, it should, from what I've seen, it shouldn't require a subsidy to operate it. The California system should not require an operating subsidy either. But that doesn't mean it's not a great project for the public to invest some money in.
Yes, ma'am.
First off, welcome back to Texas. We're delighted to have you here. The I-20, Interstate 20 Corridor Council seeks to connect Dallas-Fort Worth and Atlanta.
Right.
In April this past year, we filed a brief in support of the KCS, Canadian Pacific merger,
Yes, thank you for that.
representing some 175 cities, throughout.
Right.
We appreciate the board's favorable consideration of that. Thank you very much for that. And we also appreciate and understand your position with respect to the pen and ink drawing of the American Indians,
Yeah.
looking at a solution for the crossing problem. We know y'all will figure that out.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And
Thank you.
I'm a passenger rail advocate from way back. I remember when I was at FRA, I went to a meeting of the mayors down in the Gulf. Trying to remember where that was. Maybe Knox remembers. But to get from Mobile to New Orleans, you want to fly through Atlanta, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So getting Amtrak back on a track they operated on successfully for a long time makes a huge amount of sense. And then the I-20 corridor, again, the Meridian Speedway is a great piece of railroad, and there's no reason that there shouldn't be a way to make that work for passenger rail as well as freight. And we're going to be making sure that CPKCS works fairly with the passenger rail advocates to work out a solution for that.
I'll stand. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you.
I was there at your Houston trip, so I know that very well. And your conversation about creating heart is the Houston area rail
Right.
transformation that we've started. And we have had a number of meetings, and we are working through it. It's a working group. Of course, CREATE is kind of I'll say it's a framework, a lot of conversations around you wanting it to be Texas, tailored.
Right.
But we welcome any, input, any, help that you can provide with us. We're meeting currently almost every 2 weeks
Wonderful.
with the working group and then
Right.
smaller committees to kind of initiate this process. And it's under the rail district as a committee.
Right.
But we have opened it out to counties that aren't actually members of the GCRD, but
Right.
are able to be a part of the HART committee. So, but thank you for that. And
One difference between Houston and Chicago is Chicago had 20 different railroads coming together. Houston, most of the right-of-ways are by Union Pacific. So if you don't get their cooperation, nothing's going to happen. But I think there's enough momentum behind this that, and with the cooperation of, CPKCS and the other railroads that run through the area, hopefully something will get done. It ain't cheap. Building, grade crossing, crossovers, eliminating grade crossings is expensive. It's taken Chicago 20 years to get just a couple of projects done. They've been really good projects and they benefit everybody. It doesn't happen overnight. But I think we also have a Congress and an FRA and DOT that understands the importance of it. They've got programs for it. So, go out there and ask for money and get the things designed. Yeah.
well, BNSF and UP are at the table, and we're working to get,
Right.
KCS and CP in there as
Yeah.
well. So, thank
Yeah,
you.
I mean, CPKCS doesn't actually own any rail line through Houston. They have trackage rights. Yeah. Anybody else? Well,
All right, thank you so
very
much.
much. Is there one more?
More.
Hold on.
Someone said I didn't need a microphone. Thank you, Ms. Smith. As someone who is an advocate for passenger service and the rail network we have,
Right.
and as a steward of it, what does it say about where we are that California's had this level of trouble getting their network up and running? Texas Central has had its problems with its ideas, getting it up and running. What's going on either in the industry or in politics or in public policy that keeps these things from happening for as long as they haven't been happening?
Right. California, by the way, is under construction. People don't seem to realize that. The first segment being built is being built in the Central Valley. And people say, well, why'd they start in the Central Valley? Why didn't they just, connect LA and Long Beach and San Diego? And I was there at the time when that decision was made. And they decided to start with the Central Valley first because it was the first piece that was environmentally cleared. The environmental clearance program process is enormously difficult for a new right-of-way. It takes a long time. And the other thing about the Central Valley is that there are a lot of people in the Central Valley. A lot of folks from outside California, they don't realize that. I mean, if the Central Valley were its own state, it would be like the 14th largest state in the United States and the poorest. Has a lot of congestion on the few roads that go through it, north and south. So there were good reasons to start in the Central Valley, and they didn't have to cross any mountains. To get even from the next link, we'll probably go to San Jose. Once they get to San Jose, then they got a direct link to San Francisco because that part of the existing Caltrain right-of-way is already electrified. But getting to San Jose is not easy. Getting from Bakersfield over the Tehechapis to LA is going to be a real lift. But once you connect, I think, San Jose, San Francisco to the Central Valley, you're going to have an extraordinary system. So it's been very hard to raise money for railroads because they do not benefit from the Highway Trust Fund. That's something that people have been advocating for a long time. Now we have a Highway Trust Fund that doesn't have enough money to even do what it's supposed to do because gas taxes haven't been raised in years. But one thing that would certainly help, is if we had a consistent source of funding for rail, because these are multi-year projects. You can't stop and start. You can do that with highways. You can build part of a highway here. Remember, some of you people are old enough to remember the original interstate highway systems. You'd have between two cities here and two cities here, and then they come back and they build this, and then maybe they do a bridge. With highways, but you can't do that with a railroad. So you really do need consistent funding. But once they're up and running and you have enough frequency, very, very important that you have frequency, then they can, operate very effectively without a public subsidy. And then you have proposals, railroads that are now being built and operating in Florida and Brightline East. Now, their advantage was they had an affiliate that owned the right-of-way. So they didn't have to fight for the right-of-way. They just had to build a couple of more tracks. And they're now, that is up and running between Miami and Palm Beach, and I think later this year it will go all the way to Orlando, and now they're looking at extending it from Orlando to Tampa. It's also not what we would call true high-speed rail, and between Miami and Cocoa Beach, I think there are 99 grade crossings. It's not optimum, but it provides tremendous relief for the 95 and really cuts down the time it takes to get from Miami to Fort Lauderdale or Palm Beach. And going to Orlando and connecting folks going to Orlando for, Disney World and Miami or Fort Lauderdale and getting on ships. I mean, it's a great business plan. So they also are building a true high-speed train from Las Vegas down to LA. And this one will take a different route than what the California High-Speed Rail was going to do. It's going to go over there's the Cajon Pass or the Tejon Pass, I always get them mixed up, on I-5 from Victorville down to where all the railroads come together in San Bernardino today, and get down to Union Station that way. Again, it won't be as fast as what's contemplated for the California high-speed rail system, but it'll be a great way to get to Las Vegas. On a Friday, it can take you 6-7 hours to get to Las Vegas. And this will, cut that time in half or more and take there's only one road that goes to Las Vegas. So that again is, it's a great connecting two city pairs, and it'll do a lot for both LA and Las Vegas in terms of economic development and the various areas in between. So I hope that part of an answer to the question.
Thank you, ma'am.
I mean, Amtrak, you could just do a little better job of beating up on the Congress. People don't remember. When Amtrak was created, the expectation was that it was going to fade away. Yeah. It was either going to make money, which of course, passenger rail run by the freight railroads never made any money, but they expected Amtrak was going to make money, and if it didn't, well, it would just go away. Because, trains and cars were going to take over. And Amtrak is still with us today, and now people are screaming all over the country for more Amtrak service. So. Thank you very much.